I'm Afshan Ratansi, and we're going underground on the birthday of the man who added 4 million to the reputed 35 million death toll in India and created the anti-Catholic Black and Tans death squads in Ireland, Winston Churchill. Coming up on the show, a victory for abstentionism, with a majority of Americans not voting at the US midterms. We go to Georgia to measure the decline of US democracy with the Green Party's 2016 vice presidential candidate, Ajamu Baraka, to the midterms, which British media arguably suggests demonstrate Donald Trump's decline, even though the GOP won seats in the Senate. Joining me now via Skype from Atlanta, Georgia, is the Green Party's 2016 vice presidential candidate, Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu, thanks for coming back on. Record-breaking turnout, but still more people didn't vote than voted. What is the point of US elections?
It is to determine every 2 or 4 years what set of oppressors will be put in office. And I hate to sound like that, but in essence, because of the very real limitations of US democracy that make it very difficult for any political challenge to take place beyond the two parties, then people are basically stuck with having to participate either supporting one major ruling class party over another. And so those of us who represent third forces like the Green Party are basically marginalized, and the consequence is that many people have concluded that the so-called democratic process in the U.S. is irrelevant, and therefore they vote by not voting.
Of course, the DNC often says it's not their fault. It's either the Russians, Facebook, or perhaps more believably, widespread reporting of voter suppression. You're, of course, in Georgia. Why is it that U.S. elections have these irregularities and accusations? It doesn't happen in Venezuela or Iran.
Well, it doesn't. And what we have in the U.S. is a decision made primarily by the Republicans to engage in voter suppression because they believe, I think quite correctly, that any expanded participation levels among the working class will be votes that will probably be picked up by the Democrats. Therefore, they have elaborated some very sophisticated schemes to suppress the vote. Here in Georgia, they have now taken us to a level of science in the sense that you had an individual who is running for the governor, who's also the Secretary of State, the office responsible for, in essence, organizing the elections, and who has been accused of engaging in active voter suppression, primarily of Black voters. He would not recuse himself, did not resign his position, and in fact, has been primarily responsible for what we see as a systematic effort to undermine the Black vote.
Of course, we saw Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. Do you think in the face of that kind of accusations, people are just going to move politics to the streets?
Well, they have to move politics to the streets. The idea that the electoral arena represents the end-all of political participation only plays into the hands of the duopoly. So even if one believes that the electoral arena is important, that has to be also connected to non-electoral political participation. So having one's positions expressed in the streets, if you will, through political organization is vitally important. And that's really the message that many of us try to advance. This idea that all politics in the U.S. should be confined just to the electoral arena only advantages the duopoly. A duopoly that does not represent the interests of the majority and certainly not of working class and poor people in the United States of America.
Of course, now the headlines shifted to the de facto firing of your Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. What exactly does an Attorney General do? Because, I mean, he toured Guantanamo last year, kept it open. He was Attorney General when the U.S. was arguably illegally bombing Syria, militarily aiding the Saudis in Yemen. Who was Jeff Sessions?
Well, Jeff Sessions is part of the Confederate movement in the U.S. He is clearly a white supremacist. And a nationalist, we believe, who was brought into the Trump administration to be the representative of the highest legal office in the land, the Attorney General. He fell out of favor with Trump, of course, because He recused himself from the Russian Gate process, and as a consequence, he was targeted by the Trump administration to be replaced as soon as the midterms were over. But this is, theoretically, that office is tasked with the responsibility of upholding U.S. law. But we know that the enforcement of U.S. law has always been skewed and toward the interests of the most powerful. Under, for example, Eric Holden, there was no prosecution of Bush administration era officials who were involved in torture. There was no investigation of the bankers who crashed the U.S. economy. So, that office theoretically is supposed to enforce the law and protect the interests of the people, but in fact, has been reduced to a instrument of whatever party is in power at the moment.
Well, I'm sure Sessions would deny he's a racist. You might say he's a nationalist, like Trump proudly does say. But now there's this caravan that Trump was name-checking all the time, the UN saying that the children show signs of mental anguish and distress. Would Donald Trump really order U.S. troops to fire on children in the caravan at the Mexican border?
Well, we have no idea what he might attempt to order. We don't believe that troops would, in fact, fire on unarmed protesters, even though Trump said that any protester that had a rock, that protester should be considered to have a rifle. We don't believe that that's going to happen. But again, it is representative of the kind of politics that we see in front and center in the U.S. because the discourse has moved away from issues that are maybe more relevant to many people to these wedge issues like this caravan. So this is part of the racial politics in the U.S. And it's something that is going to be with us for the next few years.
And there's obviously coverage of the caravan in other NATO nations. In Britain, not very much about why people should want to leave their homes and try and enter the U.S. On the Mexico border. What about in the United States? Much debate about U.S. foreign policy impact and as a catalyst for immigration?
One of the positive consequences of the caravan has been that within the U.S., people are attempting to try to understand why people are moving toward the U.S. border. And as a consequence, people are looking at the conditions in these various countries. And they're posing some serious questions. And that allows us to provide answers. So we can explain to people that one reason why you have such a large number of people who are leaving Honduras and coming to the U.S. is as a consequence of U.S. policies in Honduras that gave the green light under the Obama administration to a anti-democratic coup in that country. We can talk about what happened in El Salvador and Guatemala. We can talk about economic policies in Mexico that have destroyed the Mexican economy and forced people into the cities and to migrate toward the north. So the people are beginning to understand that the interests of working class people and poor people in the U.S. are very similar to the interests of working class and poor people in Central America. So the sort of internationalist perspective is now developing more as a consequence of this caravan and the kinds of questions that people are raising. So it's been a very, I think, positive and unintended consequence of this situation.
And just briefly, there's been a lot of talk of identity politics, optimism about the new Congress. Do you think, if not class politics, do you think Muslims in Congress for the first time are going to make any difference as regards U.S. policy on Israel?
Well, I suspect not. I do think that if some of those individuals take a very strong line, that will be helpful. But one's ethnicity or race has nothing to do with one's political stance. So it's going to be a very lonely task if they are not able to bring more individuals within the Democratic Party in line with real support for Palestinian rights, real support for putting a brake on U.S. policies in the so-called Middle East that's responsible for the destruction of various nations in that part of the world. The task still is trying to move one of those parties to a position where they will be in opposition to the permanent war agenda of both parties. It's a very difficult task, but one in which they're going to have to take on in conjunction with those of us who are outside of the duopoly, but who understand that it's vitally important for us, the people, to put a brake on U.S. policies that are responsible for the death and destruction of millions of people around the world.
Ajamu, Baraka, thank you.
My pleasure.